"I don't know why we're even having this conversation again," my father said, his voice carrying that familiar edge of disappointment as he set down his coffee mug with more force than necessary. "That design school was a waste of money, and now you want to quit your job? For what, Olivia? To sell recycled clothing from our garage?" Mom sat beside him, arms crossed, her silence somehow more cutting than his words. The rejection letter from the fourth investor this month lay crumpled between us on the kitchen table, alongside the past due notice for my student loans. I was about to defend myself when my phone lit up with an email notification. As I read the subject line, the blood rushed to my face. Forbes 30 under 30, final selection interview request. My parents watched in confusion as my expression transformed from defeat to disbelief. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Olivia Chen, and 3 years ago I was sitting at my parents' kitchen table in Mapleton, a small manufacturing town where dreams were supposed to be practical and ambitions reasonable. I'd graduated from design school despite my family's objections, convinced that sustainable fashion could be both beautiful and ethical. While my peers chased jobs at fast fashion giants, I'd become obsessed with the environmental devastation caused by the industry. The chemical waste, exploitative labor, and mountains of discarded clothing filling landfills. I started Rethread when I was 24, initially as a weekend project while working as a junior designer at a corporate fashion label. At first, it was just me, collecting discarded fabrics from local factories and transforming them into unique pieces. I sold them at farmers markets on weekends. My profits immediately reinvested in better equipment and materials. Every garment included details about its environmental impact and the story of its materials. Customers were intrigued, but my family saw only a distraction from a real career. "The fashion world chews up dreamers like you," my mother would say, not unkindly but with absolute certainty. She'd worked 30 years in human resources at the town's largest employer, a furniture manufacturing plant that was now operating at half capacity due to overseas competition. My father, an engineer at the same factory, had even more practical concerns. "This country doesn't make things anymore, Olivia. That's just reality." My sister Emma had followed their blueprint precisely. Business degree, accounting certification, engagement at 23, mortgage at 25. Family gatherings inevitably featured subtle comparisons and sidelong glances whenever I mentioned sustainable design concepts that sounded utterly impractical to them. "You've always lived in a fantasy world," my dad said that morning in the kitchen, gesturing toward the rejection letter. "Even as a child, always drawing and cutting up perfectly good clothes to remake them." He wasn't wrong about that part. I'd been redesigning my clothes since I was 12, turning outdated hand-me-downs into pieces that expressed who I was, or who I wanted to be. "This isn't fantasy," I insisted, my voice stronger than I felt. "Rethread is building something real. Consumers are waking up to the true cost of fast fashion." My mother sighed, that familiar sound of resigned disappointment. "Honey, people want cheap clothes, not ethical fashion statements. They don't care where it comes from as long as it's affordable." She'd said variations of this same sentence countless times, and each repetition cemented her certainty. I held up my phone, showing them the Forbes email. "Then why would Forbes be interested?" My father adjusted his glasses, skepticism evident as he read the screen. "An interview isn't an achievement, Olivia. Anyone can get an interview. Let's see if anything actually comes of it before you throw away your stable job." What hurt most wasn't their doubt. I'd grown accustomed to that, but their inability to see that the stable path they valued was disappearing. The manufacturing plant was laying off workers every quarter. The town was hollowing out as young people left for cities. The economic security they'd known was already gone. They just hadn't fully admitted it yet. As I gathered my things to leave, my mother followed, me to the front door. Her expression had softened slightly. "Before you go," she said, hesitating, "there's a box in the attic you should probably take. It belonged to your grandmother." I waited impatiently as she climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. My relationship with my grandmother had been limited to holiday visits before she passed, when I was 15. I remembered her as a quiet woman who made incredible quilts but rarely spoke about herself. Mom returned with a dusty cardboard box labeled "Margaret's Things" in faded marker. "Mom never wanted us to follow in her footsteps," she explained, something unfamiliar in her eyes. Regret, perhaps. "But maybe you should see this anyway." Back in my small apartment, surrounded by fabric scraps and design sketches, I opened the box. Inside were dozens of clothing patterns, fashion magazines from the 1960s with pages carefully marked, and a leather portfolio containing technical drawings with impeccable detail. Beneath these were bundles of letters, from small manufacturers throughout New England, addressing my grandmother as Ms. Margaret Chen, design director. My quiet grandmother, who I'd only known as someone who made holiday meals and quilts for church fundraisers, had been a fashion designer with her own small label. The letters detailed production runs, fabric sourcing challenges, and design modifications. Most surprising were her detailed notes on reducing fabric waste, natural dyeing techniques, and pattern cutting methods that minimized scraps, sustainable practices decades before sustainability became a buzzword. At the bottom of the box was a small leather-bound journal. The first entry, dated April 1962, read, "Today, I registered Chen Designs as an official business. Father says I'm bringing shame to the family by pursuing such frivolous work." "Mother," cried, "but the cutting table is set up and I have orders for 12 dresses already. This is only the beginning." The journal chronicled her journey: initial success, manufacturing challenges, a small write-up in a regional fashion magazine, struggles with larger competitors who could produce more cheaply. The entries grew sporadic after 1968, with the final one simply stating, "Close the workshop today. With the baby coming and David's new position requiring more travel, it's the practical choice. Perhaps someday I'll return to design, but family must come first now." That baby was my mother. My grandmother had abandoned her design career to raise her children, including the daughter who would grow up to discourage me from following a creative path. The irony wasn't lost on me. Tucked into the final pages was an envelope addressed simply to my future designer in elegant handwriting I recognized as my grandmother's. "If you're reading this," the letter began, "you've inherited more than my fabric scraps and pattern notions. You've inherited a vision that I couldn't fully realize in my time. The fashion world tells us that newer is better, that more is always preferable to less, that constant consumption is the path to happiness. This is the lie that keeps us trapped, both the maker and the wearer. True design considers not just how a garment looks, but how it lives in the world, how it's made, who makes it, how long it lasts, and what happens when its first purpose is complete. This approach wasn't valued in my day. Perhaps it will be in yours. The world will tell you that practical dreams are the only ones worth having. This is the second lie. Practical dreams keep us comfortable, but rarely move us forward. If you've found this letter, you've already chosen the harder path. Know that you come from a line of women who understand what it means to create something from nothing, to see possibility where others see only scraps. Whatever you choose to make of your life, make it with intention, design with purpose, and remember that no vision worth pursuing comes without resistance. It was signed simply Margaret, with a small sketch of a sewing needle and thread forming an infinity symbol beneath her name. I read the letter 4 times that night, each reading revealing something I'd missed before. My grandmother had faced the same doubts from her family that I now faced from mine. She had pursued a vision of fashion that considered environmental impact and maker welfare, Concepts now marketed as revolutionary, but that she had quietly practiced decades ago. And she had ultimately set that vision aside for practical concerns, a decision that seemed to carry a weight of regret, even in her careful handwriting. What would rethread look like if I applied her techniques using modern technology? What if her journal wasn't just family history but a business blueprint ahead of its time? Most importantly, what if my mother's discouragement wasn't just practical? Concern but unprocessed grief for her own mother's abandoned dreams? The next morning, I called in sick to my corporate design job. I spent the day photographing every page of my grandmother's journal and patterns, creating a digital archive of her work. I analyzed her zero-waste cutting techniques and adapted them to contemporary silhouettes. I called 3 local seamstresses who had been laid off from a shuttered uniform factory and asked if they'd be interested in contract work using their existing home sewing equipment. By evening, I had completely rewritten my business plan. Rethread would no longer be just my small side project upcycling discarded garments. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It would become a distributed manufacturing network, connecting skilled sewers working from home with consumers seeking transparency in their clothing choices. We would combine my grandmother's waste-reducing techniques with modern digital pattern distribution. Each garment would carry the story of its materials and maker. Sleep eluded me that night. My mind raced with possibilities, comparing my grandmother's careful pattern notes with modern digital fabrication techniques. At 3 a.m., I created a spreadsheet comparing the cost structure of traditional manufacturing with my distributed model. The numbers were startling. By eliminating multiple layers of markup and centralizing only the design process while distributing production, we could create ethically made garments at prices competitive with mid-range retail brands, while providing fair compensation to makers. I had just dozed off when my alarm rang at 6 a.m. Habit nearly sent me to my corporate job, but as I stood before my closet, something shifted. I reached for my phone and composed an email to my supervisor, explaining that I was resigning effective immediately. I didn't mention Forbes or my business, just that I needed to pursue another opportunity. Then I made coffee and got to work building Rethread 2.0. My tiny apartment became command central. The living room transformed into a sample-making space, with my grandmother's patterns taped to the walls. The kitchen table disappeared under fabric swatches and material samples sourced from dead-stock suppliers. My bedroom became a photography studio where I documented each step of the process for the makers who would eventually reproduce the designs. The first challenge was standardization, how to ensure consistent quality across multiple home-based producers. I created detailed video tutorials demonstrating each technique, developing a quality control checklist that makers would submit alongside photos of their work at critical construction stages. The second challenge was scalable pattern distribution. I researched digital pattern-making software, teaching myself through online tutorials and adapting my grandmother's analog designs into parametric digital files that could be personalized to individual measurements. Within 2 weeks, I had refined prototypes of 5 garments, each utilizing my grandmother's zero-waste cutting techniques adapted for modern fabrics and silhouettes. I had established relationships with 3 home-based sewers and developed a pricing structure that paid them hourly rates well above industry standard. What I lacked was capital to purchase materials in quantities that would make production efficient and sustainable media content to explain our innovative model to consumers. The Forbes interview was scheduled for that Friday. I spent every waking moment preparing, refining my pitch and practicing responses to potential questions. Unlike previous investor meetings where I'd dressed in conservative business attire, trying to look the part of a serious entrepreneur, I decided to fully embrace my identity. I wore a jacket I'd designed and made myself using reclaimed denim and vintage kimono silk, paired with simple black pants and boots. If they wanted to understand my vision, they needed to see it embodied. The interview took place in a sleek downtown office tower, 37 floors above the street. 4 judges sat across a polished conference table: a venture capitalist specializing in sustainable businesses, a fashion industry veteran who had led several major labels, a tech entrepreneur who had built a successful e-commerce platform, and a business journalist who covered retail innovation. The 5th seat remained conspicuously empty. "We apologize," the assistant explained as she showed me in. "Ms. Rodriguez is running late but asked us to begin without her." I arranged my samples and materials on the table, connecting my laptop to the projection system. As I prepared to start, the door opened and a woman in her 50s entered, her presence immediately commanding attention. She wore a simple black dress with architectural lines that I recognized as coming from a sustainable luxury brand known for ethical manufacturing. "Please continue," she said, taking the empty seat. "Diane Rodriguez. Sorry for the delay." I took a deep breath and began. "Rethread isn't just sustainable fashion," I explained, showing them my digital portfolio alongside physical samples. "It's a revival of lost knowledge combined with new technology. We're not creating another clothing brand. We're building an entirely new manufacturing ecosystem that brings production back to communities that have been abandoned by globalization." I demonstrated how my grandmother's zero-waste pattern cutting eliminated the 15–20% fabric waste typical in conventional manufacturing. I showed how our distributed production model reduced carbon emissions by eliminating long shipping chains. I explained how our digital quality control system ensured consistency across home-based producers. The fashion industry veteran Andrea Simmons looked skeptical. "This small-scale, distributed approach can't possibly compete on price with established manufacturers. The economics simply don't work." It was the same dismissal I'd heard at my parents' table, just in a different accent. Instead of shrinking from it, I pulled up our projection slides. Actually, by eliminating traditional retail markup and centralizing design while distributing production, our cost structure is 34% more efficient than conventional manufacturing. We're small by design, not by limitation. I walked them through the numbers, how our direct-to-consumer model eliminated multiple markups, how our zero-waste pattern cutting reduced material costs, how our distributed manufacturing eliminated the need for a centralized factory. "What about quality control?" asked the tech entrepreneur, thumbing through one of my samples. "These are well made, but can you maintain this standard across dozens or hundreds of makers?" I opened our quality management system on my laptop. Each maker completes a standardized training program before joining our network. During production, they submit photos at critical construction stages for review. We use AI-assisted quality checking to flag potential issues before completion, and we conduct random in-person inspections of finished products. The questions continued, probing every aspect of the business model, from intellectual property protection to scalability challenges, from material sourcing to marketing strategy. With each answer, I felt my grandmother's vision merging with my own modern approach, her attention to craft and material with my understanding of digital platforms and contemporary sustainability concerns. As the interview concluded, Diane Rodriguez, who had been mostly silent throughout, asked one final question. "What happens if a major label offers to acquire Rethread? Would you sell?" I thought about my parents' kitchen table, about my grandmother's closed workshop, about the manufacturing jobs that had left our town never to return. "Rethread isn't built to be acquired," I answered. "It's built to be replicated. Our goal isn't to become the next fashion conglomerate, but to create a model that can be adopted by communities worldwide. The intellectual property, the patterns, the zero-waste techniques, the distributed manufacturing approach, those stay open source. What we sell is the verification, the quality assurance, and the storytelling platform that connects maker to wearer." As I packed up my samples, Andrea Simmons approached me. "Your construction techniques are impressive," she said, examining the seam finish on one of the jackets. I haven't seen this particular method since my early days at the atelier in Milan. It's my grandmother's technique, I explained. She documented dozens of methods that prioritize durability and material efficiency. They fell out of favor when speed became the industry's primary value. Smart woman, your grandmother, Andrea said, handing back the jacket. The industry is finally catching up to her thinking, though most brands are just using sustainability as a marketing tool rather than redesigning their entire production model. As I left the building, I had no idea if I'd made the Forbes list, but I felt strangely at peace. In preparing for this opportunity, I had found something more valuable than recognition. I had discovered my place in a lineage of creative problem solvers, women who saw fashion not just as adornment, but as a system that could be redesigned to better serve both people and planet. The weeks following the interview were a blur of activity. I took the remainder of my savings and invested in materials for our first official production run: dead stock fabrics from a luxury brand's excess inventory, organic cotton from a mill that was struggling to find buyers after its main client, moved production overseas, buttons made from compressed agricultural waste that would otherwise be burned. I was negotiating with 2 additional makers to join our network when my phone rang. The screen displayed an unfamiliar number with a new York area code. "Is this Olivia Chen?" a brisk professional voice asked when I answered. "Yes, speaking." "This is Claire Walsh from Industry Innovations. We're putting together a feature on sustainable fashion startups, and your name came up in our research. I understand you recently interviewed for the Forbes 30 Under 30? My heart sank slightly. Not Forbes calling with good news, just another industry publication looking for content. "Yes, that's right," I confirmed, trying to keep the disappointment from my voice. "Excellent. We're particularly interested in your distributed manufacturing approach. Would you be available for an interview next week? We're profiling 5 emerging designers, and your model is quite different from the others we're featuring." I agreed to the interview, grateful for any exposure that might bring attention to Rethread's mission. As I hung up, I reminded myself that external validation wasn't the point. Building a viable alternative to exploitative fashion production was what mattered, whether or not I made some magazine's list. The Industry Innovations interview led to a small feature that caught the attention of Elaine Montgomery, Chief Sustainability Officer at Davidson Group, a mid-sized retail company with stores across the country. She reached out the day after the article was published. "Your approach to production is fascinating," she said during our initial call. "Most sustainable brands focus on materials or working conditions, but few are questioning the fundamental production model itself." We explained that Davidson was looking to diversify their supply chain, particularly for their house brand of basics. They were concerned about both environmental impact and the public relations risks of overseas manufacturing, but hadn't found a domestic production model that could compete on price. "Would you be open to a pilot project?" she asked. "We'd commission a small collection using your distributed network, with potential for expansion if it meets our metrics for quality, timeliness, and cost." The opportunity was both exciting and terrifying. Working with Davidson would provide the capital to expand our maker network and refine our processes, but it would also mean adapting our artisanal approach to meet commercial deadlines and price points. Could our model scale without sacrificing its core values? "We'd want this to be a true partnership," I said carefully. "Not just a supplier relationship. Our makers are skilled professionals, not interchangeable production units. And our zero-waste approach requires design collaboration from the beginning." "That's precisely why we're interested," Elaine replied. "We don't want to just source differently. We want to design differently. We need to learn how." The following week, Elaine visited Mapleton to see our operation firsthand. She met with several of our makers in their home studios, observed our quality control process, and reviewed our cost structures in detail. By the end of her visit, we had outlined a 6-month pilot project, a collection of 10 essential garments to be produced through our network, with transparent documentation of the entire process. This isn't just about making clothes, Elaine explained as we finalized the agreement. It's about creating a case study that could transform how Davidson approaches production more broadly. If we can demonstrate that distributed, ethical manufacturing can be commercially viable, it opens possibilities beyond this initial collection. I signed the contract that afternoon, my hands trembling slightly with the weight of responsibility. This wasn't just an opportunity for Rethread. It was a chance to prove that alternative production models could work at commercial scale, that sustainability didn't have to be a niche luxury or a marketing gimmick. The project immediately presented challenges we hadn't faced with our small batch production. We needed to standardize processes across more makers, develop more rigorous quality assurance protocols, and refine our digital pattern distribution to accommodate various skill levels. Most critically, we needed to balance fair compensation for our makers with price points that would be viable in a retail environment. I worked 18-hour days alongside our growing team, refining systems and solving problems as they arose. We developed a tiered training program that allowed makers with different skill levels to contribute appropriately while continuing to develop their expertise. We created modular designs that could be assembled in stages by different specialists. We implemented digital tracking that maintained transparency while streamlining coordination. 3 months into the project, we had a workable system that preserved our core values while meeting Davidson's requirements. Our makers were earning living wages with flexible schedules that accommodated their other responsibilities. Our designs maintained zero-waste principles while achieving price points comparable to mid-range retail brands. Our quality control processes ensured consistency across distributed production. As we prepared to ship the first completed items to Davidson's headquarters for review, I received an unexpected message, an invitation to present our work at a sustainable business conference in San Francisco the following month. The invitation came from Andrea Simmons, the fashion industry veteran who had seemed so skeptical during the Forbes interview. "We're hosting a panel on reimagining fashion. Supply chains," her message explained. "Your work with Davidson Group has been attracting attention in industry circles. I'd like you to share your model and preliminary results from the pilot project." I was surprised she knew about the Davidson partnership. We hadn't publicized it while the pilot was still in progress. When I mentioned this during our follow-up call, Andrea laughed. "The fashion industry runs on gossip and whispers," she said. "When something genuinely innovative happens, word gets around. And what you're doing is genuinely innovative, even if it's built on your grandmother's old-fashioned techniques." I agreed to speak at the conference, though I was nervous about presenting our work in progress to industry professionals who might be highly critical. Elaine offered to join the panel to provide the retail perspective, which gave me some reassurance that I wouldn't be defending our approach alone. The conference was held at an upscale hotel in downtown San Francisco, with attendance primarily from fashion industry executives, retail buyers, and sustainability consultants. Our panel was scheduled for the second day, giving me time to attend other sessions and get a feel for the current industry discourse around sustainability. What I observed was both encouraging and disheartening. There was clearly growing interest in sustainable practices, but much of the discussion focused on incremental improvements to existing systems rather than fundamental reimagining of how clothing is produced and consumed. Presentations highlighted marginally better materials, slightly improved working conditions, and modest waste reduction. All important steps, but none addressing the core problems of overproduction and disposability. By the time our panel began, I was more convinced than ever that our approach offered something genuinely different. Rather than trying to make a fundamentally flawed system slightly less harmful, we were building an alternative system from the ground up. The moderator introduced our panel on innovative supply chain models and gave each speaker 5 minutes for opening remarks before the discussion and audience questions. I was scheduled to speak second, after a presentation on blockchain technology for supply chain transparency. As I took the microphone, I looked out at the audience of industry professionals, people who had built careers within the very system. I was challenging. For a moment, I felt like an imposter. Who was I to tell these experts that their approach to production was fundamentally misguided? Then I remembered my grandmother's journal, her precise documentation of techniques that prioritized material efficiency and garment longevity in an era before sustainability was a marketing term. I thought of my parents, who had found renewed purpose applying their skills within our alternative production model. I thought of Maria, James, Lakshmi, and all our other makers who had been discarded by conventional manufacturing but were now creating beautiful, durable garments under conditions that respected their expertise and humanity. The fashion industry has a fundamental scale problem, I began. We've built a system that requires constant growth, constant consumption, and constant disposal to remain profitable. We've centralized production to maximize efficiency at the expense of resilience. We've separated designers from makers, consumers from producers, creating distance that allows us to ignore the human and environmental costs of how our clothes are made. The room was silent as I continued. At Rethread, we're not just using better materials or improving working conditions within the existing system. We're building an entirely different model, one that's distributed rather than centralized, relationship-based rather than transaction-based, and scaled to human needs rather than shareholder demands. I explained our distributed manufacturing network, our adaptation of traditional zero-waste techniques for contemporary production, our direct connection between makers and consumers. I shared preliminary results from the Davidson pilot project, demonstrating that our model could achieve commercial viability while maintaining ethical standards. The conventional wisdom says you can have clothes that are fast, cheap, or ethical. Pick two, I concluded. We're challenging that assumption by redesigning the production model itself. When you eliminate multiple layers of markup, reduce material waste through pattern innovation, and connect skilled makers directly with customers, you can create garments that are ethically made, reasonably priced, and built to last. The discussion that followed was lively, with questions ranging from practical concerns about quality control and scalability to philosophical debates about consumption and growth. Elaine provided valuable perspective on the retail challenges and opportunities, while I focused on the production methodology and maker experience. What surprised me most was the response from other panelists and audience members who worked within conventional fashion production. Rather than dismissing our approach as impractical idealism, many expressed genuine curiosity and even cautious optimism about elements they might adapt for their own operations. "Your distributed quality control system is fascinating," commented the supply chain director for a major sportswear brand. "We've been struggling with similar challenges in our global production network, just at a different scale." After the panel, I was approached by representatives from 3 different companies interested in learning more about our model, as well as a professor from a leading design school who wanted to incorporate our approach into her curriculum. Even Andrea Simmons, who had organized the panel, seemed impressed by how much we'd accomplished since the Forbes interview. "You've moved beyond theory to implementation," she noted. "That's where most sustainable fashion initiatives falter. They have beautiful visions but can't make the numbers work in the real world." As I waited for my flight home the next day, I received an email notification that made my heart skip. A calendar invitation for a video call with the Forbes editor who had conducted my interview months earlier. The subject line read simply, 30 under 30 follow-up. My immediate reaction was confusion. The list had surely been finalized by now. It was too late for me to be included. Perhaps they were researching for next year already? Or maybe they wanted to feature Rethread in some other capacity? I accepted the invitation and tried not to overthink what it might mean. Regardless of external recognition, the work was what mattered, and the work was going well. The Davidson pilot was exceeding expectations, our maker network was growing, and our approach was gaining attention from industry professionals who could help amplify its impact. 2 days later, I joined the video call from my small apartment, wearing one of my own designs, a structured jacket made from reclaimed denim, with zero-waste pattern cutting. The editor, Meena Patel, greeted me warmly. "Thank you for making time, Olivia. I wanted to update you personally, rather than having you receive a formal email." She paused, her expression serious. "As you know, our selection process for $30 under 30 is extremely competitive, with thousands of nominations for limited spots." I nodded, preparing myself for the polite rejection I'd anticipated months ago. "You were among our finalists, but ultimately not selected for this year's list," she continued, confirming my expectation. "I understand," I said, trying to mask my disappointment. "I appreciate your consideration and the opportunity to interview." "That's not why I'm calling," Meena said, surprising me. "We've been following your work since the interview, particularly your partnership with Davidson Group and your presentation at the Sustainable Business Conference last week." She explained that Forbes was launching a new initiative focused on business model innovation, companies and individuals reimagining fundamental systems rather than simply improving existing ones. They wanted to feature Rethread as a case study in their inaugural publication. "What you're building isn't just a sustainable fashion brand," Meena said. "It's a prototype for distributing production in a way that could be applied across multiple industries. That's the kind of systemic innovation we want to highlight." The feature would be more substantive than the brief profile included in the 30 under 30 list. A full article documenting our model, its impacts, and its potential applications beyond fashion. They would send a photographer to Mapleton to capture our makers at work in their home studios and conduct interviews with everyone involved in the Davidson pilot project. "This is an opportunity to share your approach with a much broader audience," Meena explained. "The 30 under 30 list celebrates individual achievement, but this initiative focuses on transformative models that could inspire change across sectors." As we discussed the details, I realized this opportunity aligned much more closely with Rethread's mission than the individual recognition of the 30 under 30 list. This wasn't about celebrating me as a young entrepreneur, but about documenting a production approach that could help revitalize manufacturing communities and create more ethical supply chains. After the call, I sat quietly for a few minutes, processing this unexpected turn of events. The initial disappointment of not making the list had been replaced by something more meaningful: recognition of the systemic importance of our work, not just my personal achievement. I called my parents to share the news, unsure how they would react. The Forbes 30 under 30 list would have been easily explicable to them, a clear marker of success they could understand and share with friends. This more nuanced recognition might be harder to appreciate. To my surprise, my father grasped the significance immediately. "They want to study your business model, not just put your name on a list? That's substantial recognition, Olivia. That means they see something truly valuable in what you're building." My mother, who had been digitizing my grandmother's patterns for our expanded production, added her perspective. "Your grandmother would have understood this perfectly. She never cared about fame or accolades. She cared about making things properly, with respect for materials and people. This recognition honors that approach." The Forbes feature was published 2 months later, coinciding with the successful completion of the Davidson pilot project. The article included stunning photographs of our makers working in their home studios, detailed explanations of our zero-waste pattern cutting techniques, and data demonstrating the economic and environmental impacts of our distributed manufacturing model. Most powerfully, it told the human stories behind the system. Maria finding dignified work after her factory closed, my father applying his industrial experience to ethical production after being laid off, my mother connecting to her own mother's legacy through pattern digitization, communities regaining manufacturing capabilities that had been lost to globalization. The response was immediate and overwhelming. We received inquiries from businesses across industries interested in adapting elements of our approach Economic development agencies reached out about implementing similar models in other manufacturing communities. Design schools requested curriculum materials about distributed production systems. Davidson Group announced the expansion of their pilot into a permanent program, committing to produce 30% of their house brand items through ethical distributed manufacturing networks within 3 years. They hired Elaine Montgomery as their first chief resilience officer, tasked with transforming their supply chain to prioritize community impact alongside environmental sustainability. 3 months after the Forbes feature, I received an invitation that brought the journey full circle to speak at my former high school's career day. The same guidance counselor who had discouraged me from pursuing design, Mrs. Barnes, sent the invitation personally. "Your work is changing how people think about manufacturing and design," she wrote. "Our students should hear from someone who's reimagining what's possible, not just following established paths." Standing before a classroom of teenagers in the school where I'd once been told that my creative ambitions were impractical, I shared not just my success story, but the messier truth of doubt, rejection, and persistence that preceded it. The world will tell you that practical dreams are the only ones worth having, I told them, unconsciously echoing my grandmother's words. But practicality changes with context. What seems impractical today may be precisely what's needed tomorrow. A girl in the back row raised her hand. "But what if your parents don't support your dreams? What if they think you're wasting your time?" I thought about my own parents, who had once dismissed my vision as impractical fantasy, but now worked alongside me in building it. I thought about my grandmother, whose innovative approaches were abandoned in her time, but found new relevance in mine. "Listen to their concerns. There might be wisdom there," I answered carefully. "But remember that their definition of practical is shaped by their experiences, their fears, their time. Your generation faces different challenges and opportunities. Sometimes the most practical path is creating something new rather than following established routes that are disappearing." After my presentation, Mrs. Barnes approached with a humility I'd never seen from her during my student days. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "I discouraged you from pursuing design because I thought I was protecting you from disappointment. I was operating from an outdated understanding of what constitutes a practical career path." "You were working with the information you had," I told her. "The future is hard to predict." "Still," she insisted, "I'm sorry. You've built something remarkable, something that matters beyond fashion or business success. You're creating opportunities in a community that desperately needs them." As I left the school, my phone buzzed with a notification from one of our production coordinators. Davidson had increased their next order by 40%, requiring us to train at least 15 new makers to meet production timelines. It was a good problem to have, but still a challenge to solve while maintaining our quality standards and ethical commitments. On the drive home, I passed the factory where my father had worked for 30 years before being laid off. A massive facility now operating at reduced capacity with skeleton crews, its parking lot half empty. In contrast, our distributed manufacturing network was expanding weekly, creating flexible, skilled employment for people who had been discarded by conventional production models. I thought about how differently this story might have unfolded if I'd followed the practical advice I'd received throughout my education, if I'd pursued engineering instead of design, if I'd remained in my corporate job instead of building. Rethread, if I'd abandoned my grandmother's sustainable techniques as outdated and inefficient. I hadn't made the Forbes 30 under 30 list, but I'd built something more meaningful than individual achievement. A working alternative to exploitative production systems, a model that honored traditional craftsmanship while embracing modern technology. A community of makers creating beautiful, durable garments under conditions that respected their humanity and expertise. Sometimes the most valuable recognition isn't a place on a prestigious list, but validation that your approach works in the real world, that it solves actual problems, creates meaningful opportunities, and points toward a more sustainable and equitable future. Sometimes the most practical thing you can do is pursue what others call impractical, because that's precisely what a changing world needs most. My name is Olivia Chen. 3 years ago, my parents told me I'd never amount to anything. Today, they work alongside me in a business that's transforming how things are made and who benefits from their creation. The path wasn't linear or predictable, but it led exactly where it needed to go. Not to prove my parents wrong, but to build something that matters in ways they never imagined possible. The months following the Forbes feature transformed Rethread in ways I never anticipated. What began as my desperate attempt to create a sustainable fashion business had evolved into something far more significant, a blueprint for revitalizing manufacturing communities through distributed production networks. Interest in our model came from unexpected directions. A furniture maker in Michigan implemented our quality control systems for home-based woodworkers. A ceramics studio in North Carolina used our training framework to develop a network of independent potters. A small electronics company in Pennsylvania adapted our supply chain approach for component assembly. Each adaptation proved that the core principles, distributed production, digital coordination, fair compensation, and quality assurance, could work across diverse industries. The Davidson partnership expanded beyond our initial pilot. What started as a small collection of basics grew into a dedicated line called Community Made, featuring products created entirely through ethical distributed manufacturing networks. They committed substantial resources to scaling the approach, not just for marketing value, but because it provided resilience in their supply chain that conventional manufacturing lacked. When the pandemic disrupted global shipping, we saw the vulnerability of centralized production, their CEO explained during a joint press conference announcing the expanded partnership. Olivia's model offers something different: production, capacity distributed across communities, adaptable to changing conditions, with shorter supply chains and greater transparency. Most satisfying was establishing the Rethread Institute, a nonprofit organization dedicated to research, training, and implementation support for distributed manufacturing across sectors. Funded through a combination of our commercial operations, foundation grants, and corporate partnerships, the Institute focused on developing open-source tools, training methodologies, and implementation guides for communities interested in building their own ethical production networks. My father, who had once dismissed my vision as impractical dreaming, became the Institute's operations director, applying his decades of manufacturing experience to help other businesses implement distributed production systems. My mother led our pattern digitization program, preserving traditional techniques while making them accessible through modern technology. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. The parents who had insisted I follow a conventional path were now finding renewed purpose in the unconventional business I'd built. What they'd viewed as impractical idealism had created practical opportunities when traditional systems failed them. "I still can't believe we discouraged you," my father said one evening as we reviewed implementation plans for a new production hub in a former coal mining town. "We thought we were protecting you from disappointment." "You were operating from your experience," I told him. "The manufacturing world you knew was disappearing, and you didn't see viable alternatives." "That's just it," he replied, shaking his head. "I knew the old model was failing, but I couldn't imagine something different. I lacked the vision to see beyond what was crumbling to what could be built in its place." This conversation stayed with me as I prepared for my biggest challenge yet, testifying before a congressional committee on domestic manufacturing innovation. The committee was examining policy approaches to support manufacturing communities devastated by globalization and automation. They had invited me alongside economists, labor leaders, and industry executives to discuss potential paths forward. I had never imagined addressing Congress. Public speaking still made my hands shake, and policy discussions seemed far removed from the practical work of building our production network. But I understood that systemic change required both ground-level innovation and supportive policy frameworks. If our model could inform better approaches to manufacturing policy, I needed to overcome my hesitation. The night before my testimony, I reread my grandmother's journal, drawing strength from her quiet determination in the face of dismissal and doubt. "Today, Father said my business brings shame to the family," she had written in 1962. "Tomorrow, I will deliver 12 dresses to clients who value my work." Both statements can be true simultaneously. The hearing room was intimidating: wood-paneled walls, elevated dais for committee members, cameras broadcasting the proceedings. I sat at a long table alongside my fellow witnesses, conscious of being younger and less credentialed than the others. The labor economist to my right had published definitive studies on manufacturing job losses. The industry association president to my left represented companies employing thousands. When my turn came to deliver opening remarks, I set aside my prepared statement and spoke directly to the committee members and the communities their decisions would affect. For decades, we've approached manufacturing decline as inevitable, the natural result of market forces beyond our control, I began. But what's disappearing isn't manufacturing itself. It's a particular model of manufacturing, centralized, rigid, and designed to prioritize short-term efficiency over long-term resilience and community well-being. I explained our distributed manufacturing approach, not with industry jargon or policy language, but with concrete examples of its impact. I spoke about Maria, who had worked in a uniform factory for 20 years before it relocated overseas, now earning more as a specialized garment constructor working from her home studio. I described how James, laid off when automation eliminated his pattern-cutting position, now trained others in a blend of traditional techniques and digital tools. These aren't just heartwarming anecdotes, I emphasized. They represent a viable alternative to both exploitative overseas production and unsustainable domestic factory models. Distributed manufacturing networks can create skilled employment in communities abandoned by conventional industries, produce goods with reduced environmental impact, and build economic resilience through diversified, adaptable production capacity. The questions that followed were rigorous but engaged. Committee members wanted specifics: how such networks could be scaled, what policy supports would accelerate adoption, how workforce development programs might evolve to support distributed production models. The most important policy shift, I told them, would be recognizing that the future of American manufacturing doesn't necessarily look like its past. We need frameworks that support diverse models, not just traditional factories or fully automated facilities, but also distributed networks of skilled makers using digital coordination tools to create high-quality products under ethical conditions. The testimony received unexpected attention, with coverage extending beyond policy publications to mainstream media. A video clip of my exchange with the committee chair about redefining manufacturing work for the digital age went viral on social platforms, introducing our approach to audiences far beyond the fashion or sustainability communities. This visibility brought new challenges. Large corporations began approaching us with partnership proposals that promised to scale our impact but risked diluting our values. Established fashion brands wanted to implement elements of our model, primarily the cost-saving aspects, without the corresponding commitments to worker equity and environmental responsibility. I found myself navigating complex decisions about growth, integrity, and impact. Which collaborations would advance our mission? Which would compromise it? How could we scale our approach without recreating the problems of conventional manufacturing in a distributed form? During this period of rapid expansion and difficult choices, I received an unexpected invitation to speak at the retirement ceremony for Mrs. Barnes, the guidance counselor who had once discouraged me from pursuing design. She was leaving education after 35 years, and the school was organizing a celebration of her impact on generations of students. My initial reaction was confusion. Why would she want me there? Our last interaction at the career day had been cordial, but hardly suggested she viewed me as representative of her successful guidance. When I called to confirm the invitation, she explained her reasoning. "You're my necessary reminder," she said simply. "The living embodiment of how even well-intentioned advice can limit rather than expand possibilities. I've spent my final years in this role telling your story to students considering unconventional paths, not as a cautionary tale about ignoring guidance, but as inspiration to pursue meaningful work even when conventional wisdom says otherwise." The ceremony was held in the school auditorium, filled with former students spanning decades of Mrs. Barnes's career. When my turn came to speak, I shared not just my professional journey, but the deeper lesson it contained about how we define practical success. "Mrs. Barnes once advised me against pursuing fashion design because it wasn't practical," I told the audience. She wasn't wrong based on the information she had at the time. Traditional fashion careers are indeed precarious, and conventional manufacturing jobs were disappearing from our community. What neither of us could see then was that the very instability she feared was creating space for new approaches, that the breakdown of established systems would necessitate innovative alternatives. What seemed impractical was actually ahead of its time, addressing problems that would only become more urgent as conventional models continued to fail. I looked directly at Mrs. Barnes as I concluded. The most valuable guidance doesn't tell young people which established paths are safest. It helps them develop the resilience, creativity, and purpose they'll need to forge new paths when existing ones no longer lead where we need to go. Afterward, Mrs. Barnes embraced me with tears in her eyes. "You've helped me understand what guidance should really mean," she said. "Not directing young people toward what worked in our time, but helping them develop the capacity to create what's needed in theirs." This interaction clarified something I'd been struggling to articulate about Rethread's evolution. We weren't just building a more ethical fashion company or even a more resilient manufacturing model. We were demonstrating that another way was possible, that systems that seemed fixed and immutable could be reimagined and reconstructed to serve human needs more effectively. 5 years after that initial Forbes rejection, what began in my small apartment with my grandmother's patterns had grown into a movement for manufacturing renewal. Rethread now operated 15 production hubs across 10 states, providing flexible, skilled employment to over 500 people. The Rethread Institute had trained more than 2,000 makers in sustainable production techniques and helped launch distributed manufacturing networks in 43 communities across North America and Europe. Most significantly, our approach had demonstrated commercial viability beyond niche markets. The Davidson partnership proved that distributed, ethical manufacturing could compete with conventional production on quality, cost, and reliability, while offering additional benefits in supply chain resilience, environmental impact, and community well-being. Other retailers had followed Davidson's lead, developing their own distributed production networks based on our model. A major furniture company was implementing a similar approach for custom upholstery work. A housewares brand was using the framework for ceramic production. Each adaptation proved that the underlying principles worked across diverse contexts. One morning, I received a message that brought my journey full circle, an invitation to submit a nomination for the Forbes 30 Under 30 list. I was still young enough to qualify, and the nomination came from Andrea Simmons, the industry veteran who had originally been skeptical of our approach. "Your work has evolved from interesting concept to industry-changing model," her message read. "The recognition is overdue." I considered the invitation carefully. Part of me wanted the validation that had eluded me earlier, the external confirmation that I had indeed amounted to something, despite my parents' early doubts. But as I reflected on everything that had unfolded since that initial rejection, I realized the list no longer held the same significance. Not making the Forbes 30 Under 30 had been one of the best things that happened to Rethread. It had forced us to focus on substantive impact rather than accolades, to build something whose value was evident in its results rather than its recognition. Our winding path had led to something more meaningful than what might have resulted from early validation and the pressure to scale quickly that often accompanies it. I wrote back to Andrea, declining the nomination but expressing genuine appreciation for her support. What we're building isn't about individual achievement or entrepreneurial success as conventionally defined, I explained. It's about demonstrating that collective approaches to production can create better outcomes for communities, workers, and the environment. That message might actually be clearer without the focus on individual recognition. That evening, I sat in my office reviewing implementation plans for 3 new production hubs in communities recently affected by factory closures. My grandmother's journal rested beside my laptop, its pages now fragile with age, but its wisdom more relevant than ever. Fashion is not frivolous when it provides dignity to both maker and wearer, she had written decades ago. The problem is not that we make clothes, but how we make them and at what cost to people and planet. The museum exhibition featuring her work had traveled to 8 cities, introducing her innovative techniques to new generations of designers. Her zero-waste pattern-cutting approaches had been incorporated into curriculum at major design schools. Her vision, once dismissed as impractical idealism, was now recognized as pioneering work in sustainable design. My parents joined me for dinner that night at their home, now filled with evidence of their involvement in Rethread's growth. My father's desk was covered with implementation guides he was developing for diverse industries interested in distributed production. My mother's computer displayed the digital pattern library she had created from my grandmother's designs, now used by makers across our network. "I found something today while organizing the attic," my mother said as we finished eating. She handed me a faded folder containing my high school career aptitude results. "Remember these? They suggested you should pursue engineering or accounting based on your test scores, not a creative field in sight." We laughed together at the narrow assessment of potential, at how standardized metrics fail to capture the possibilities that emerge when traditional boundaries are crossed, when engineering precision meets creative vision, when artisanal craftsmanship integrates with digital coordination, when individual talent connects with community needs. What those tests couldn't measure, my father observed, was your ability to see systems differently, to recognize that the pieces of a broken model could be reconfigured into something better. As I drove home that night, I passed the factory where my father had worked for 30 years before being laid off. A massive facility now partially repurposed as a community manufacturing center using our distributed production model, where once a single company employed hundreds in rigid shifts doing standardized work, now dozens of small enterprises created diverse products through flexible, coordinated networks of skilled makers. I thought about how differently this story might have unfolded if I'd followed the practical advice I'd received throughout my education, if I'd pursued engineering instead of design, if I'd remained in my corporate job instead of building Rethread, if I'd abandoned my grandmother's sustainable techniques as outdated and inefficient. I hadn't made the Forbes 30 under 30 list, but I'd built something more meaningful than individual achievement. A working alternative to exploitative production systems, a model that honored traditional craftsmanship while embracing modern technology. A community of makers creating beautiful, durable goods under conditions that respected their humanity and expertise. My name is Olivia Chen. 5 years ago, my parents told me I'd never amount to anything. Today, they work alongside me in an organization that's transforming how things are made and who benefits from their creation. The path wasn't linear or predictable, but it led exactly where it needed to go. Not to prove my parents wrong, but to build something that matters in ways none of us could have imagined. Sometimes the most practical thing you can do is pursue what others call impractical, because that's precisely what a changing world needs most. 6 years after founding Rethread, I found myself facing an unexpected milestone, my 30th birthday. The significance wasn't lost on me. I had officially aged out of Forbes 30 under 30 consideration forever. It was a strange thought, considering How that recognition had once seemed so vital, then so irrelevant in my journey. My parents insisted on hosting a celebration at their home, now filled with evidence of their involvement in Rethread's growth. My father had converted the garage into a small workshop where he tested quality control protocols for new maker networks. My mother had transformed the spare bedroom into a digitization studio for historical pattern archives, her computer surrounded by carefully preserved vintage designs. The invitation list reflected the unusual path my life had taken. Makers, from our original production hub, corporate partners from Davidson, academic collaborators from the Rethread Institute, even Mrs. Barnes, my former guidance counselor now retired but still mentoring students interested in creative entrepreneurship. I arrived early to help with preparations and found my mother in the kitchen, arranging photographs on a large poster board. It was a timeline of my life: childhood art projects, high school design competitions, college graduation, and the evolution of Rethread from tiny startup to international movement. "Mom, what's all this?" I asked, picking up a photo I'd never seen before. My grandmother in her workshop, bent over a cutting table with a young child beside her. With a shock, I realized the child was my mother. "I found it last week," she explained. I was maybe 4 years old. I barely remember this day, but apparently I used to help her before I lost interest in design. I studied the image, my grandmother's focused expression, my mother's small hands carefully placing pattern weights. The photograph captured something precious that had nearly been lost to time, a connection across generations, knowledge passed, from mother to daughter to granddaughter, though not in a straight line. "Your grandmother tried so hard to share her passion with me," my mother said quietly. But I was determined to be practical, to take a different path. I became the exact opposite of her: linear, risk-averse, suspicious of creative pursuits. She arranged the photograph alongside others showing Rethread's development, our first production hub, congressional testimony, international implementation workshops. "When you found her patterns and started using her techniques, I was terrified," she admitted. "Not just because I thought you'd struggle financially, but because I felt guilty. I'd rejected what she tried to give me. And here you were, embracing it. It felt like a judgment on my choices." This was a level of vulnerability I'd rarely seen from my mother. Despite our improved relationship over the years and her active involvement in Rethread, we'd never fully addressed the emotional undercurrents of those early conflicts. How deeply my choices had challenged her identity and the narrative she'd constructed about her own life. "It wasn't about you, Mom," I said gently. "I wasn't trying to prove you wrong or suggest you should have made different choices." "I know that now," she replied. "But parents have this peculiar blindness. We see our children's choices as referendums on our own. When you rejected the practical path we'd urged, it felt like you were saying our lives had been wasted, our values misguided." My father entered from the backyard carrying serving trays. "Are we having the serious conversation before the party?" he asked, his tone light but his expression understanding. I was hoping we might wait until after cake. My mother smiled. "I was just explaining to Olivia why we were such difficult parents." "Ah," he nodded. "The great parental apology. Well, I've been rehearsing mine for years." He set down the trays and joined us at the kitchen table, his hands, once dedicated to precision engineering, now equally skilled at crafting implementation guides for distributed manufacturing, resting on the timeline of photographs. "The hardest thing for parents," he said thoughtfully, "is accepting that our children will face a world different from the one we knew. We prepare you for the challenges we understood, using wisdom that served us. Then, reality shifts, and suddenly, our hard-earned knowledge becomes outdated, even counterproductive." My mother touched a photo showing the three of us at the opening of Rethread's 5th production hub. We were so certain about what practical meant: get a stable job with benefits, build seniority, avoid creative fields with their feast or famine cycles. It was the formula that had worked for our generation. But that world was already disappearing, my father added. The manufacturing sector was hollowing out. Loyalty to companies was no longer rewarded with security. The practical path we insisted on was eroding beneath our feet, and we couldn't see it, or didn't want to. I'd never heard them articulate this so clearly. We'd reached a working reconciliation years ago, finding new roles and relationships through Rethread's growth. But this felt different. A deeper reckoning with the fundamental misunderstanding that had driven those painful early conflicts. "I forgave you both a long time ago," I said quietly. "You were trying to protect me from struggle and uncertainty. You couldn't have known how things would change." My father shook his head. "That's generous, but not entirely accurate. Part of me did see the changes coming, watched factories closing, automation eliminating skilled positions, younger colleagues being laid off despite their credentials. I just couldn't imagine any alternative. I lacked the vision to see beyond what was crumbling to what could be built in its place." "We didn't need forgiveness for being wrong about the economic future," my mother clarified. "We need forgiveness for how our fear became judgment, how we dismissed your vision instead of supporting your attempt to navigate a changing world." She reached across the table and took my hand. "When we said you'd never amount to anything, we weren't really talking about you. We were expressing our terror that the world no longer functioned according to rules we understood. You were creating something new, and instead of admiring your adaptation, we condemned it because it highlighted our own uncertainty." This level of self-awareness and vulnerability from my parents was unexpected. We'd built a professional rapport through our work together at Rethread, but had carefully avoided reopening the emotional wounds from those early confrontations. "I'm not sure forgiveness is even the right framework," I said carefully. "You were operating from love and genuine concern, just with limited information. And everything worked out, better than any of us could have imagined." It worked out. Despite our discouragement, not because of our support, my father pointed out. That's the part we need forgiveness for, that when you needed champions, we became obstacles. The doorbell rang, signaling the arrival of the first guests. My mother squeezed my hand before rising to answer it. "We can continue this later," she said. "But know this, watching you build something meaningful from what seemed like impractical dreaming has been the greatest gift of our lives. Not just because Rethread provided us new professional opportunities when our traditional careers ended, but because it taught us that wisdom isn't static. Each generation must reimagine what's practical for the world they actually face, not the one their parents prepared them for." The party that followed was joyful, bringing together people from different chapters of my journey. Maria, one of our first makers, brought her daughter who had recently completed the Rethread Institute's advanced training program. Diane Rodriguez, whose early investment had helped scale our model, discussed implementation strategies with community leaders. From 3 states, Professor Williams from the design school shared updates on curriculum changes inspired by our zero-waste approaches. Midway through the evening, my father called for attention and raised his glass. 30 years ago, we welcomed Olivia into a world we thought we understood, he began. We had such clear ideas about what success meant, what paths were worth pursuing, what dreams were practical. We tried to map her future according to our past. He glanced at me, his eyes reflecting pride and a hint of lingering regret. Fortunately for all of us, she had the courage to ignore our wisdom and create something we couldn't even imagine. Not just a business, but a new model for how meaningful work can be organized, how communities can be revitalized, how traditional knowledge can be preserved through modern technology. My mother joined him, raising her own glass. We once told her she'd never amount to anything following her creative dreams. Today, we celebrate how gloriously wrong we were and how much we've learned from her journey. The room filled with applause and laughter, but I noticed tears in My mother's eyes behind her smile. Later, as guests began to depart, she pulled me aside into the quiet of her sewing room, the space where she now digitized historical patterns for our maker network. "There's something else I need to say," she said, her voice steady but vulnerable. "Something I've never fully articulated." She opened a drawer and removed a familiar leather-bound journal, my grandmother's design notebook that had inspired Rethread's approach. "When your grandmother tried to teach me her techniques, I wasn't just uninterested. I was actively resentful," she admitted. Her work required such focus, such dedication. As a child, I felt it took her attention away from me. I rejected not just her craft, but everything associated with it: creativity, entrepreneurship, the entire identity she tried to share. She carefully turned the pages, stopping at a technical drawing annotated in my grandmother's precise handwriting. "When you began following this path, my discouragement wasn't just about practical concerns. It was about my unresolved relationship with her, with the parts of myself I'd rejected. Seeing you embrace what I had denied stirred up complicated feelings I'd never properly addressed." She closed the journal gently. "So my forgiveness request isn't just about those hurtful words at the kitchen table. It's about recognizing that my reaction to your choices was filtered through my own unhealed relationship with your grandmother. You became the canvas for my unresolved feelings about her, about creativity, about paths not taken." This level of self-awareness took my breath away. My mother had always seemed so certain, so defined by her practical nature. Seeing her acknowledge these deeper emotional currents helped me understand our early conflicts in an entirely new light. "Mom, there's nothing to forgive," I said, meaning it completely. "We're all shaped by these invisible inheritances, patterns of thought and emotion passed down through generations. You responded to my choices based on your experience, just as I'll someday react to situations based on mine." I touched the journal that had transformed not just my professional path, but our entire family dynamic. "If anything, I should thank you for preserving Grandma's work even when you didn't value it yourself. If you'd thrown away these patterns, if you hadn't kept her tools, Rethread would never have existed." "I couldn't bring myself to discard her things," she admitted. "Something in me knew they mattered, even if I didn't understand how or why. Perhaps some wisdom bypasses conscious understanding, waiting for the right moment to resurface." We embraced, the journal pressed between us. A physical manifestation of knowledge preserved through one generation to find expression in another. Of values transmitted even through apparent rejection. Of wisdom that found its time when the world was ready to receive it. Later that night, as the last guest departed, I found myself in the backyard with my father, looking up at the stars visible even through the town's modest light pollution. "Your grandmother would be astonished by what you've built," he said. "Not just the business success, but how you've preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost." "I think about that sometimes," I admitted. "How easily her approaches could have disappeared completely. How many other valuable techniques and perspectives have been lost because they seemed impractical in their time?" He nodded thoughtfully. "That's the tragedy of dismissing ideas that don't fit current paradigms. We lose solutions that might become essential when circumstances change." We stood in comfortable silence, the weight of our history, the painful confrontations, the dismissive words, the gradual reconciliation, and now this deeper understanding, settling into something like wisdom. "I want you to know," my father said finally, "that while I regret discouraging you, I'm deeply grateful for the journey. Not just because it created new opportunities when my conventional career ended, but because it expanded my understanding of what's possible. You taught me that innovation often means questioning fundamental assumptions about how things must be done." The simple sincerity in his voice moved me more than any formal apology could have. This wasn't about erasing past hurts, but acknowledging how they had shaped our growth, individually and together. That's what matters most to me, I told him. Not that you were wrong or I was right, but that we all found a way to evolve beyond our initial positions, that we created something meaningful together, combining your practical experience with my creative vision and Mom's organizational skills. My father smiled, placing his arm around my shoulders as we had stood so many times before, at my college graduation, outside the bank after securing our first major investment, before my congressional testimony. But this time felt different. The completion of a circle, the healing of an old wound, the integration of past conflict into shared wisdom. The greatest gift of parenthood, he said softly, isn't seeing your children follow your path. It's watching them create paths you couldn't have imagined, and perhaps, if you're fortunate, being invited to join them on the journey. As we walked back inside, I thought about the complex inheritance that had shaped my life. My grandmother's technical skills preserved despite being undervalued in her time, my parents' evolving understanding of practicality in a changing world, my own journey from rejected dreamer to systems innovator. None of us had followed linear paths. We had all navigated contradictions, doubts, and unexpected opportunities. The forgiveness my parents sought wasn't really about erasing past mistakes, but about acknowledging how we transform limitation into growth, how being wrong can lead to deeper understanding, how conflict can eventually yield collaboration, how what seems like rejection might actually be preservation in disguise, waiting for the right moment to find expression. My name is Olivia Chen. 6 years ago, my parents told me I'd never amount to anything pursuing my impractical dreams. Today, we work side by side in an organization that's transforming how things are made and who benefits from their creation. Our path wasn't linear or predictable, but it led exactly where it needed to go. Not just to business success or personal vindication, but to a deeper reconciliation that honors both traditional wisdom and new possibilities. True forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past, but integrating it into a more complete understanding, recognizing that our conflicts and missteps, our fears and judgments, are often invitations to greater wisdom if we have the courage to examine them honestly. Sometimes the most valuable legacy isn't what we deliberately pass on, but what we preserve without fully understanding its future importance. Patterns of thought and creation that wait patiently for the world to catch up to their wisdom. 10. Years after founding Rethread, I stood on a stage at the Global Sustainable Business Summit, accepting the Transformative Innovation Award. The audience included industry leaders, policymakers, and students from around the world. As I looked out at the crowd, my gaze fell on my parents in the front row, their faces beaming with pride. When we speak of transformation, I began, we often focus on external changes, new technologies, improved systems, reimagined business models. But the most profound transformations happen internally, in how we define success, understand value, and envision possibility. The decade since finding my grandmother's patterns had been a journey I could never have predicted. Rethread now operated 23 production hubs across 4 countries, providing dignified, flexible employment to over 1,200 skilled makers. The Rethread Institute had trained more than 5,000 people in sustainable production techniques and helped establish distributed manufacturing networks in 68 communities. Our approach had been adopted by companies in furniture, ceramics, electronics, and even specialized medical device production. A decade ago, I was told I'd never amount to anything pursuing my impractical vision, I continued. Today, I'm not sharing this recognition as vindication, but as an invitation to reconsider what practical actually means in a world facing interconnected crises of climate, inequality, and community resilience. As I spoke, images appeared. On screens behind me, makers working from home studios, community production hubs, training workshops, digital coordination systems. The visuals told the story of an approach that balanced traditional craftsmanship with modern technology. individual creativity with collective production, local manufacturing with global coordination. The most practical innovations often appear impractical at first because they challenge fundamental assumptions about how things must be done, I explained. Distributed manufacturing seemed inefficient compared to centralized production until global supply chains collapsed during crises. Preserving traditional craft techniques seemed quaint and unscalable until we paired them with digital coordination, tools. Prioritizing maker well-being seemed financially unsustainable until we eliminated unnecessary middlemen and retail markups. After the ceremony, at the reception, I was approached by a young woman clutching a notebook. She introduced herself as Maya, a design student from India working on distributed production models for rural artisan communities. "Your grandmother's techniques have inspired our entire approach," she explained, showing me sketches that adapted zero-waste pattern cutting to traditional Indian textiles. When I read about how you discovered her methods decades after she documented them, it made me wonder what other wisdom we're overlooking from previous generations. This was the most meaningful aspect of Rethread's growth, not the awards or recognition, but how the approach had transcended any single company or industry to become a framework others could adapt and evolve. Maya's project was reimagining craft traditions not as artifacts to preserve, but as living systems capable of providing sustainable livelihoods in a digital age. Later that evening, I joined my parents for dinner at a small restaurant near the convention center. My father raised his glass in a toast. "To the impractical dreamer who changed how we understand practicality," he said with a warm smile. "And to the grandchild who gave new life to her grandmother's legacy." "I've been thinking about legacy," my mother said, setting down her glass. "Not just what we leave behind, but how it transforms in ways we could never predict." She had recently retired from her role at Rethread, though she still consulted on special projects. At 65, she had embraced a new identity as a historian of sustainable design, documenting overlooked innovations from women and immigrant designers, whose contributions had been marginalized in mainstream fashion narratives. "Your grandmother never knew her techniques would find new relevance in addressing climate change and economic inequality," she continued. "I never imagined my organizational skills would help scale an ethical production model. You couldn't have predicted that your small sustainable fashion brand would evolve into a blueprint for manufacturing revival." My father nodded thoughtfully. "That's the nature of true innovation. It transcends its original purpose, finding applications the creator never envisioned." He had recently published a book on distributed manufacturing implementation, drawing on his experience helping diverse industries adapt Rethread's approach to their specific contexts. At 68, he had found an unexpected role as a bridge between traditional manufacturing expertise and emerging production models. The transformative power isn't in any single technique or technology, he reflected. It's in the underlying principles, distributed rather than centralized, collaborative rather than hierarchical, regenerative rather than extractive. As we talked, I realized how profoundly our roles had evolved over the past decade. My parents, once the voices of conventional wisdom warning against impractical dreams, had become eloquent advocates for systemic innovation. I, once the rebellious dreamer challenging their practical concerns, had developed deep appreciation for the structural knowledge and organizational expertise they contributed. "I've been approached about writing a memoir," I told them. "The publisher wants to focus on the against all odds narrative, how I succeeded despite discouragement and rejection." My mother winced slightly. "Not the most flattering portrayal of your parents." "Which is exactly why I'm hesitating," I explained. "That framing misses the more nuanced truth. How different forms of wisdom complement each other. How intergenerational knowledge transfer isn't always direct or immediate. How initial conflict can evolve into meaningful collaboration. The actual story isn't about proving us wrong," my father said, understanding immediately. It's about how different perspectives ultimately came together to create something none of us could have built alone. He was right. The simplified narrative of the visionary entrepreneur overcoming doubters made for compelling marketing, but missed the deeper reality of how innovation actually unfolds. Through tension between tradition and disruption, practical constraints and imaginative possibilities, individual vision and collective implementation. If you do write it, my mother suggested, perhaps frame it around your grandmother's legacy, how knowledge preserved without being fully understood found new relevance when conditions changed. That seems more honest than portraying us as villains in your hero's journey. We laughed together at her candid assessment. This was the gift of our evolved relationship, the ability to acknowledge past conflicts with humor and perspective, recognizing how they had shaped our growth individually and collectively. The following morning, before flying home, I visited a small museum exhibition on sustainable design history. In a quiet corner, I found a display featuring my grandmother's original pattern drafts alongside contemporary applications of her techniques in diverse industries. The curatorial text explained how her methods, once deemed too labor-intensive or impractical for mass production, had found new relevance in addressing 21st-century challenges of resource conservation and ethical manufacturing. As I studied the exhibition, I noticed a group of design students sketching and taking notes. Their professor was explaining how zero-waste pattern cutting eliminated material waste while creating distinctive aesthetic elements that actually distinguished the garments from mass-produced alternatives. These techniques weren't abandoned because they didn't work, the professor explained. They were set aside because they didn't align with the priorities of industrial mass production: speed, standardization, simplified worker tasks. But as our priorities shift toward sustainability and maker well-being, approaches once deemed impractical become not just viable, but necessary. I didn't identify myself as I listened, preferring to observe how my grandmother's work was being interpreted and transmitted to a new generation. One student raised her hand to ask a question that caught my attention. If these methods were known decades ago, why did the industry abandon them? Didn't they realize the environmental consequences? The professor's response was thoughtful. Innovation isn't linear or purely progressive. As industries evolve, certain knowledge is foregrounded while other approaches are marginalized. Often, wisdom that doesn't serve immediate economic priorities gets labeled impractical or outdated, despite its intrinsic value. The challenge for each generation is to reassess supposedly settled questions in light of emerging challenges and values. Her words crystallized something I'd been struggling to articulate about Rethread's journey. We hadn't invented new techniques, so much as recovered overlooked approaches and adapted them to contemporary challenges using modern tools. The true innovation wasn't technological, but conceptual, reimagining what practical means when we expand our metrics beyond short-term efficiency to include environmental impact, community well-being, and system resilience. As I prepared to leave the exhibition, the professor noticed me and approached with recognition in her eyes. "You're Olivia Chen, aren't you? Would you be willing to say a few words to my students about how you're applying these historical techniques in modern contexts?" I agreed, and spent 30 minutes with the class discussing the bridge between traditional craftsmanship and digital coordination, between individual creativity and collective production. Their questions revealed genuine engagement with the deeper implications of distributed manufacturing, not just as a production method, but as a framework for more equitable and sustainable economic relationships. One student asked the question that had been on my mind throughout the summit: what comes next? How does this model evolve from here? That's for your generation to determine, I replied. We've demonstrated that distributed, ethical manufacturing can work at meaningful scale, that it's not just a boutique alternative but a viable approach for diverse industries. How you adapt and evolve these principles to address emerging challenges will write the next chapter. On the flight home, I reflected on the decade's journey, from desperate entrepreneur working from a small apartment to leader of a movement, reimagining production systems. The simplified narrative would present this as a linear progression from rejection to vindication, but the reality was far more textured and humbling. The transformation wasn't just in our business model or production approach, but in relationships and perspectives. My parents had evolved from skeptics to essential collaborators, bringing complementary wisdom that shaped Rethread's growth. My understanding of innovation had shifted from creating something entirely new to recognizing and revitalizing overlooked wisdom. Our collective definition of practical had expanded beyond immediate economic metrics to include resilience, sustainability, and human well-being. As the plane began its descent toward home, I opened my laptop to outline thoughts for the potential memoir. Rather than structuring it as a triumph over adversity narrative, I began sketching a different framework, tracing how knowledge flows across generations, sometimes directly but often circuitously, how innovation emerges from tension between tradition and disruption, how intergenerational collaboration creates possibilities that neither generation could achieve alone. The title that came to mind wasn't about proving anyone wrong or challenging conventional wisdom. Instead, it honored the complex transmission of knowledge that had made everything possible. Patterns preserved. How forgotten wisdom finds new purpose. Because sometimes the most valuable legacy isn't what we deliberately pass on, but what we preserve without fully understanding its future importance. Patterns of thought and creation that wait patiently for the world to catch up to their wisdom. And sometimes the deepest forgiveness comes not from forgetting past conflicts, but from recognizing how they shaped our growth, how being wrong can lead to deeper understanding, how initial rejection might ultimately yield meaningful collaboration. My grandmother's journal still sits on my desk, its pages now fragile with age, but its wisdom more relevant than ever. Beside it rests a photograph from my 30th birthday, my parents and me standing together, our expressions reflecting not just professional accomplishment but personal reconciliation. These tangible reminders of our journey represent something beyond success or vindication, the recognition that true transformation happens not when we prove others wrong, but when we integrate diverse forms of wisdom to create something none of us could have imagined alone.